What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at Unforetold Witchstone, a CRPG that launched into early access on Steam just a couple days ago from the time of this video. And as it is a game I have been watching for a fair bit of time, I naturally wanted to take a look at it. That said, it's important to remember that this is an early access title. CRPGs are notoriously difficult to make, so there are plenty of rough edges to obviously take note of that you'll see in the footage here. But it does have some really, I would say, ambitious systems and a few fresh ideas even that are especially cool. As it stands, what is in early access is about half of what should be there at launch in terms of the story, content, etc. The major systems are in place, which means what you're taking a look at here isn't that dissimilar from something like an alpha, and thus things are going to change over time. But at its core, I would say this game is inspired by the likes of games like Divinity Original Sin, and more recently Baldur's Gate 3, of course, but it still does a fair few unique things. To kick it off from the beginning, though, let's take a step back and talk about the story. Unforetold Witchstone takes place in the realm of Calsundia, a relatively recent country that was born out of a conflict between two empires. The refugees from that conflict went north to a land of abundance and essentially a frontier area, and when the empires had fought themselves out and had to turn north for resources, they found a united front of refugees and outcasts there that effectively were able to repulse the two weakened empires, thus becoming their own independent state. And then our character enters. Someone who has been bonded by mind-controlling magic due to our own innate magical abilities. We find ourselves running to Calsundia to seek refuge and hopefully find a way to break the compulsion, they call it. Now, outside of that, what makes this game interesting is that there's not really a main story outside of that one singular goal. How you go about doing that, how you interact with the world, is all incredibly dynamic through the game's influence system, which includes things like joining factions, siding with one or the other, going a more independent route, and usual things you would expect from an RPG. But more specifically, the influence system allows you to walk up to just about any NPC and convince them to do things or open up solutions you might not have necessarily thought of. And the game highlights this right at the beginning, with you needing to escape the docks you landed at in order to get to a train to go further inland. How you go about doing that is largely freeform, though. They'll give you a couple pointers and kind of general hints about ways you might approach it, but ultimately it's up to you. Now, when you're talking directly to individuals, though, you'll get the option to pick influence, and then you can request what it is you want them to do, and then after that, you can choose the skill check to represent how you would like to go about doing said thing. Now, in addition to things that directly involve you in that manner, there's also things that will be happening around you passively. For instance, once you get out of the starter area, your train gets attacked and two factions go head to head. At which point you can decide who to side with. Maybe you could talk someone into just leaving passively without fighting, or any other number of solutions. So basically there's just a lot going on. Now, how you choose to approach those is of course going to have consequences, but so is the absence of action. But given how you built your character, what is actually available to you option-wise might also be changing. So while I don't want to go into much more detail than that just due to the early access nature of these things and how it might change, it's needless to say an ambitious system, and just the bit I've experienced so far is very promising. But when it comes to building a character, let's talk a little bit about that. So again, this isn't going to be all of the final options, but to put it simply, their RPG system here is, I would say, kind of like those 5th edition D&D compatible modules. I would say the underlying system is very D&D 5e with a few alterations and tweaks. So if you're familiar with that system at all, this will likely feel relatively familiar for you, which extends through combat, which we'll get to. Now, in character creation, you can pick your background, which will give you a set of starting equipment and initial proficiencies. You can pick an ancestry, which is your race. Right now, they have human, elf, and dwarf available. And then your archetype is your class. You'll pick from 4 basic options, a cleric, fighter, rogue, or wizard, and then you can pick a specialization to go farther into that. and the specializations so far have seemed really cool. For instance, you can pick a wizard who is an elementalist, so your standard blaster caster type, or you can choose to be an arcane sniper wizard, which is effectively a marksman that utilizes magic to make their shots more effective, while also just being able to cast spells. The fighter archetype comes with a dual-wielding pistol specialization, for instance, and these are going to affect the abilities and things you'll gain as your character starts to level up, though as you start to level up, you can actually multi-class, that is to say take on a second archetype as well, which is going to add that much more customization to it. You're going to wrap up character creation with attributes and skills. Now your attributes are very straightforward, using what has become the standard for Dungeons & Dragons, or say Pathfinder for instance, where your attribute score then contributes to a modifier which will then be used in all sorts of roles, such as for your skills. Now skills are relatively tame, there's only a handful of them, but it goes more the Pathfinder 1E route where you've got your modifiers from things like your ability scores, and then every level you'll put points into these skills to raise them higher. But in order to raise them, you do need to have proficiency with them, which will come down to the previous choices you've made. So all in all, I would say character creation is a combination of various things I've seen in tabletop variants, which certainly isn't a bad thing. Now from there, I want to wrap this up by talking a little bit about the gameplay of it. Basically, if you've ever played an isometric CRPG, you will get the gist of this. We'll be running around talking to all sorts of people, picking up potential party members as we go, which you can see on screen here. The game itself is divided up into maps though, so it's not like some big open world, but rather you'll be on one map at a time, such as, for instance, Howling Valley, which is like your first big settlement you'll arrive at, and your goal here is to speak with people and figure out what you can do to further your aim of getting rid of your compulsion. And you're going to find all sorts of various leads that will help you decide how you want to approach that, and how you dealt with things earlier, such as the ambush on the train, might influence this a good bit. But you're pretty much free to approach it however you will, talk to whoever you can, join up with a faction, choose to go solo, or simply do what you want here and then move on without talking to much of anyone. So it has a very free-form approach to its gameplay, which includes things like diving into stealth mode, attacking anyone and everyone, though all of those actions will have consequences. Though I will say it is a tad bit buggy here and there. For instance, I did get caught stealing something in-game, even though I wasn't technically stealing it. It was just something I dropped on the ground, and then that crime was reported, but then the guards never actually did anything. So it's a little all over the place there. Now, as you're running around doing all of this, you will have potential companions in tow, should you choose to accept them, and while they will have things to say and conversations to add to what you're doing, they are sort of their own people. For instance, you don't really control the whole group at a time. You're in control of your character, and you can tell people to wait or follow you, and you can occasionally give them orders to do something that they're better at, such as lockpicking or something, but they level up on their own. You don't make any of those decisions for them. They kind of just do their own thing, and I think that is intended to be a consequence of the influence system. But I would say the downside of this is that in combat, this means that combined with their lack of a downed state, it's very possible for your character to just sort of get one shot by a lucky crit or something on the enemy side of things, and you just immediately game over. So I think things like that are definitely going to need to be tweaked over the early access period, but the potential is there. Now, when it comes to combat specifically, it is a turn-based system, and it is heavily leaning on, I would say, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition in that regard. It's not one for one, but it is your move and action system. Many of your actions can be bonus actions, and then you can do those, of course, on top of your regular attack, alongside a basic reaction system even, and honestly, many of the spells are basically one for one as well. So combat-wise, very 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, albeit with different numbers and things. Now, to wrap this video up, I would like to kind of just share an anecdote about some of the gameplay I encountered, because I think it might give you an idea of how this plays a little better. So when I was leaving the initial area, that is to say I jumped on the train to Howling Valley, you get attacked midway there by a bandit group who attacks the faction on board known as the Commonwealth. You can choose which one to side with. I went ahead and decided to kill the bandits, mostly because they had some cool gear that I wanted to get. Having done that, you get an invitation from the Commonwealth to join them, and they might be able to help you out with your compulsion as a result. So when I get to Howling Valley, I go rest at the inn, which acts as a long rest for the sake of magic and things like that, and I go find the Commonwealth recruiter after going around town and looting everything that wasn't nailed down. The recruiter basically says that if I want to join up properly and get their help, they need me to go kill another bandit leader out in the swamp area not too far from here. So I jump on over there, and I initially plan on going in a stealth route because I'm playing an arcane sniper, that is to say the magical marksman. However, I notice that these guys aren't actually hostile when I get there, so I just stroll into their camp and they confront me about not being allowed there. But I managed to pass a lucky influence check to convince them that I am actually allowed to be here, which is fine for the people outside the cave. I then proceed into the cave, where I know I don't have the skill to keep passing these checks, so then I start utilizing my marksman here to start taking out enemies before they can see me, because I have a pretty decent range, and with a little bit of stealth this works quite a bit, and I find my way all the way to the end of the cave, where I then confront the bandits. So along the course of all of those decisions, there were multiple other avenues available to me the entire time. For instance, I could have sided with the bandits when I initially got attacked by the train, and then I assumed I would have met them in the swamp somewhere to discuss further. At any time, you can attack basically anyone, so that's theoretically an option. When I got to the swamp and cave itself, I could have gone a full frontal guns blazing, or I could have gone stealth the entire time. And as you saw, I did persuade them to let me in, and you can even persuade the bandit at the end to join up with the faction you're there to represent. And all of those things together kind of give me the idea right now that this influence system that they're working on, the kind of cornerstone of this particular game, is incredibly ambitious, and when it's working, it's a ton of fun, but it does feel a little clunky to interact with at times, which is the main takeaway for the rest of the game. It's certainly putting the early in early access. A lot of the systems are rough and lack a certain degree of polish. So for the casual person just curious about a new CRPG, I would say hold off, wait for this thing to actually release, because if you're going to buy into it in early access right now, it is exactly that, just very early. And while I think it has really great potential to be a really cool CRPG, it certainly needs a lot of work before it gets there. But with that said, I am definitely continuing to keep an eye on this one. I can honestly say I'm pretty impressed by some of the systems they're working on here, and I think if they get some of the rough edges smoothed out, alongside just filling the game out with more content in general, then they will really be on to something. That said, that's going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.